Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is one of Springfield's first oncologists, Dr. Robert Carolla. Because oncologists treat cancer, they deal with issues of mortality probably as much or more than other specialists. They are called upon to counsel their patients about balancing the lengths of their lives and the quality of the time that they have left. For a lot of us, that would be depressing. However, Bob Carolla is a cheerful guy. In addition to his work with Hospice Foundation, the Ozarks, he and his wife Peg are very involved in the Springfield art scene. Bob and Peg received nationwide attention a couple of years ago after their interview on National Public Radio's StoryCorps broadcast regarding his work with the families of patients who had died. He joins me today to share some of the common themes of regrets and hopes that he has heard from his patients and how that has changed his own perspective on life and death. Bob, welcome to In Our Town.
Delighted to be here.
Well, it's good to have you. Maybe a little background. How did you decide to become an oncologist?
Well, I had a very impressive early life experience. I had a brother who died of acute leukemia at age 4. I was 11 at the time, and I was not told of the diagnosis.
Okay.
Everyone in our little town of 10,000, Sydney, Ohio, knew the diagnosis, but I didn't. And it involved long stays in the hospital, at University Hospital in Columbus, and then often trips to Columbus for blood work and seeing the doctor. And I found out from a schoolmate as I was walking home from school who said, well, you know your brother has cancer of the blood, don't you?
Oh,
and
my.
I didn't. That's how I found out.
Why was it kept from you?
Well, that was the way it was in those days. We're talking about 1953. I remember in 1950, my parents were driving to see a colleague of my dad's who was dying. And no one would use that word. He was quite isolated and lonely. And he asked that my dad and my mother come and visit him. So mother said, that Nora, the wife, got together with the doctor and they decided they were not going to tell Scotty what his diagnosis was. And that was standard. They thought the news would be too devastating for him. And so they kept it from him. And now that's not the case. So this is an evolution of patient communication that I've seen through the years that is all for the good. But, I'm old enough to know the way it used to be.
Clearly that informed your decision to specialize in oncology.
It had something to do with it, but the doctor that cared for my brother, I never met, a famous Dr. Charles A. Doan, sent a letter after my brother died to my parents that was very consoling to them. And they talked about it, showed it to all their friends. And 50 years later, when my mother died, I was going through her papers, and in her bedside table was this letter. So she had slept next to it for 50 years.
Gave her a lot of comfort.
It gave me a lot of comfort, absolutely. Well, flash forward, I was a medical student at Ohio State. And one day I was working in the lab, and I walked down the hallway, and Dr. Doan walked down the hallway. I only knew him by his name tag, and he had already retired, and he just stopped in the office to pick up some mail. But he looked at my name tag, and he knew who I was.
Oh, no kidding.
Instantly. And that was a really important moment in my life. That's when I decided that I wanted to be that type of doctor. And
isn't it sometimes you have to wonder if the stars aren't wired when
yes.
you have those kind of coincidences.
I just couldn't. I was just so shocked. And he asked about mother, and Dad had subsequently died, and he was very involved.
So you came to Springfield and started practicing oncology, in the 70s?
1978.
78. And we'll get into this a little bit more, but, I listened to the StoryCorps interview that you and your wife, Peg, did. It was very moving to me.
Yes.
And it was about writing letters to the survivors of your patients. Tell us how you started doing that.
Well, the stimulus was that my parents got a letter, and I always remembered that. And this was never done, Doctors, a patient dies, well, you got to move on to the healthy ones, and that's, water under the dam. My situation was that physicians took care of the patient in the inpatient and the outpatient setting, which is different now. You have different physicians in the hospital and then in the outpatient. And I couldn't be providing service 24/7, so I would share call with other people. And I would come into the hospital some mornings, and I wanted to see a patient who was very ill that I had a lot invested in, many years of caring, and knew the family well. And I go by the room, and it was empty.
Oh my.
And I knew that the patient had died through that night. And I felt cheated that I couldn't be there to comfort them. And so I tried different things. I would go to the visitations at the funeral home, but it was never very satisfying. There were so many people there, and I never could really talk to them seriously.
Yeah, the line has to keep moving.
Yes. And I went to, I was asked to speak at about 3 funerals by the family, and I considered that a great honor. And then I thought, well, why don't I just write letters? And so I did.
What did you say in your letters?
Well, it had many components. The first important thing to me is that the letter had to be 1 page, and it had to be presented in a form that the family knew it was not a form letter. I think a form letter on a death is a disaster.
It almost makes it worse.
Yeah, so I would always thank them for being so cooperative and, having the patient there on time and communicating with me. And I would always say something personal and often humorous. When you take care of someone for 20 years, there's always something that funny that happens along the way. So I'd remind them of that. And then I would thank them for their cooperation. And the big punchline was that they did everything they could to help the family. Grief after death is a wasted emotion. It can torture people for years. And actually, to see that in written form was much more powerful than just telling it to the patient.
Well, they can reread it.
Yeah, they have a document. And I would end that it was such an honor for me to care for them, so forth. And that was pretty much the standard format. I had a real shocking experience when I had written a letter to a woman who had died, and then several years later her husband developed lung cancer and was dying, and he asked me to care for him. And I got a call from the hospice nurse that, first of all, I just can't make house calls on all these people. But if someone says they want to talk to me, I go. So I went, he wanted to talk to me, and it was a very personal thing about our relationship. But when I went to the house, I scheduled maybe a 7 o'clock early evening because I was working all day. So I get to the house, and there is the entire family in the living room wanting to meet me.
Oh, my.
And then they proudly showed me the letter that I had written many years before on the death of the wife. And it was hanging in the living room for all to see. And that bowled me over. I thought, wow, I just couldn't believe it, that piece of paper was so important. But then again, when I looked at my mother's bedside table, that's where I learned about it.
I think for a lot of us, it would be hard to be constantly dealing with people who are dying. I mean, for many people, they almost have an allergy to being around somebody like that. Why hasn't it affected you that way?
Well, it does affect me, but interspersed with the sadness is the cures. And since about 1992, the death rate from cancer in general has decreased by 1%.
Per year.
Yeah, and those 1% have added up since. Oh. So they clearly have more effective treatments, and people are living longer. So that's a reward in it. And I don't know, when when you complete the process and close the file and you've written the letter, there is a sense of peace for me too. That I try to think that I've done the best that I can. I'm not perfect. Some things I could have done better, but in the long run, when you're dealing with these devastating illnesses, it really doesn't make much difference in the end.
I know you know about him because you mentioned him to me, well-known oncologist Ezekiel Emanuel.
Yes.
And he's rather famous for writing an article in the Atlantic Monthly in 2014, which was Why I Hope to Die at 75. And I think that to some extent that was the editor writing a catchy headline.
Yeah.
But talk a little bit, if you will, because, at 75, your tomorrows are much fewer than your yesterdays. How do you counsel somebody who has a potentially terminal diagnosis about balancing some treatment that is very difficult, like chemotherapy, with the quality of life? How do you work through that with them?
If they have a highly treatable illness with chemotherapy or radiation, I try to encourage them to go for the treatment. But I say that I am willing to give you the very best treatment that we know of for this disease. But if it doesn't work, I think we need to have a serious talk about whether you want to go forward, and I've had many of those talks. If it works, great. But, at least half the time it doesn't work, and that's the time for serious talk.
And you feel miserable during the process,
right.
don't you? Yeah.
Well, that leads me into hospice, where most of the patients are older. It's primarily a Medicare service. And when patients reach a point where the toxicity of the treatment is worse than doing nothing at all is when I think we should call in hospice. These treatments are extremely toxic, and it's not unusual for someone to go onto hospice and feel dramatically better. It's because the treatment is stopped. And so they do have a grace period of improved health, but of course, in the end, the underlying disease does progress, and the event and the disease is terminal. So I like to give patients choices, and when I think of a Scotty that had no choice, what that breeds with is a sense of uneasiness because he doesn't know what's wrong with him. He doesn't want to think the worst. And people friends don't know how to act around someone with cancer. They don't know the right thing to say, and they don't want to say anything that is offensive or interpreted in a wrong fashion. And so they stay away, and that leads in isolation. So fear layered upon isolation is a terrible way to spend your last days.
It occurs to me that in some sense, even though you're treating the patient, you're treating the family as well.
Absolutely. I put patients and families on hospice. And the reason that I do that is because of all the services that are available. You have hospice in this community is home-based. And that's where people want to be. They want to be in their home to die. But it takes a lot of work and effort to care for someone, especially when they reach the advanced bedridden stage. But hospice provides, practical things like a walker, a wheelchair, an electric bed to sleep in. But it also provides regular nursing, RN nursing visits to see how they're doing. And a trained nurse dealing with a dying patient can spot complications ahead of time before a disaster occurs and the patient ends up in the hospital, which is the last thing that you want to happen. And they provide nurse assistants that can come in regularly and provide bathing and get the patient up. And social workers, chaplains are all there to counsel the patient and the family in this process. To go on hospice, a physician has to certify that someone has 6 months or less to live, which is just a guesstimate. No one knows. I've seen people who were slowly dying that last longer than 6 months, but the benefits still proceed. Mm-hmm. But one of the problems that we have is reluctance of patients to accept hospice. It has a dirty name out there, and it's equated with giving up. I don't want to go on hospice because they'll think I'm giving up. And I will give up, but that's not the truth. The truth is it's giving up the aggressive treatment, but substituting that with an aggressive program to get the most longevity out of patients, to get pain control, to get all this counseling and help in the home. It's say that it's giving up is the biggest misnomer, and it's hard to get that across to people. And so that's why we have instituted what we call palliative care, where a patient who has a serious illness that will probably be fatal and can still continue therapy, but and on his regular insurance, not the Medicaid hospice insurance, but you are closely supervised by a specialized nurse practitioner who is well aware of the fact when hospice really needs to come in. And through time, being on palliative care, this nurse practitioner develops a relationship with the patient and the family and knows how to slide them in to hospice at the appropriate time.
You know, I've read, as you get older, you tend to read the obituaries
Oh,
more and
it's
more.
the first thing I do. And the Springfield Daily Citizen does such a nice job with that. It's the first thing I do every morning.
That was not a plug that I put him up to audience, but we do appreciate it. But, you know, it's always pleasant to read in the last paragraph of an obituary a gratitude that the family is expressing to the caregiver that they had.
Yes.
You know, I think that's very meaningful. We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon Kay, and I'm the visual journalist at the Springfield Daily Citizen. I started out working overnights at KTTS. I did do my internship at KSMU. After that, I traveled on down to Branson. I very quickly became the news director down there. Afterward, I started working for Carbon Trace Productions, and there I was the executive director. I really see being a journalist in general as being a public service. My days, they are both regimented and not at all. Doing like my day-to-day task, which includes like the calendar and the obits, from touring along with one of the reporters to working on a Photoshop project so that way we can really make our product here at Springfield Daily Citizen shine. One of my favorite things about living in Springfield is that you never know who you are going to meet. We are one of those like big, small towns, and so you can meet these people that are internationally famous and you find out that they live in Springfield.
You've talked a lot about relieving pain and that sort of thing, but what goes through people's minds when they have a terminal diagnosis and they know maybe it's a couple years, maybe it's 6 months? What are the regrets that you hear people talk about and the things that they hope to tie up before they pass? Maybe you could tell us a couple stories or just speak to that.
I will tell you that one of the, Medicare, to certify a hospice, it has to have bang, 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 all these offerings for them. But really, one that is not required, but I have seen evolve if the hospice caregivers are doing their job, is these ancillary things that can happen in developing the relationship. Patients are encouraged to write final letters to their loved ones, to invite people, friends that are maybe fearful of coming to visit them, for the patient to take the initiative. Often the patient has to be the strong one in the family in this situation.
Just a parenthetical remark there. We've all had friends that we know aren't going to be with us forever. From time to time, said I'd like to come see them, come visit with them, but frequently I have the family wanting to shelter them from any sort of guests or visitors, and at the end of the day, what you want to do is what's best for the patient.
Right.
But I'm not so sure that they wouldn't want to say goodbye to their friends. Yeah. What do you think on that?
I don't agree that should be done, I guess is what I would say. And that's why hospice families need counseling as well as the patient. Mm-hmm. So a good hospice, I think, can bring in what I call end-of-life enrichments. Ask the patient some questions and ask them to record it. Questions like, how do you want to spend the time you have left? What's the best advice you've ever seen? Let's write it down. So that we can give it to your family. Is there anyone you want to connect with before dying? And what would you like people to think of you when they remember you? And these are really important questions. I think it kind of diverts from the physical issues and the pain and all of that the patient is experiencing. And, you can always Google life review questions.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think that I encourage that because I think that patients will get the most out of it. But one of our major problems that we have, if I can switch to something else, is that patients get on hospice too late. This is because of the fears. And the issues are patient fears, family fears, but it's also the physicians. Their training is to save life, to preserve life, to make the correct diagnosis and do everything that you can to save that patient. And it's hard for them to step back and take a look at the overall condition of the patient and what's happened in the last few months.
Well, it's maybe not reflects well on everybody in your profession, but in a sense, aren't they incentivized monetarily to keep them going?
And, well, I don't know that I would say all physicians are like that.
No, I didn't mean to suggest that.
But there's always...
I wonder about some of the procedures that people go through their last days.
You're right. And there's always one more medicine to give. We have this new medicine. Let's try it. And that puts the patient and family on edge, looking for a miracle. And I've seen miracles happen, but I think that it causes false hope. And, for example...
And, to me, Bob, it's not fair. I can think of a particular case of a farm family I knew growing up. Grandma was old and she was dying, but these were simple folk, and they felt they would be guilty if they didn't do one last procedure, and they ended up having to lose the farm because they were guaranteeing all these extraordinary measures at the end of life.
I would call them torture. Let's call them what they are, torture.
Yeah. You're offended when you see that happen.
Absolutely.
Now, maybe it's incompetence, maybe it's greed, and hopefully it's isolated, but that's not the way Grandma wanted. She didn't want the family to lose the farm.
Well, in that case, the outcomes of all these procedures was not explained to them, and no one in their right mind wants this, but it happens. There's sort of a snowball effect, one thing, then another, and then another, and it's sad. The other thing is that the importance of the family in these situations, because when there are multiple siblings, there can be differences of opinion as to how to handle the last stages. And there can be one sibling that just won't rest until everything is done that's possible. And there'll be others that say, let's let Grandma go. And the sibling will come to the office with a list of doctors they want me to call and in Boston and New York City and see if they could transfer, which is just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it would cost $70,000 to transfer a patient, and they wouldn't take her in that condition anyway. Yeah. So you have to work carefully in counseling. And let me tell you, I have some wild stories to tell when there's a major dysfunction pre-existing all of this.
Well, tell us what.
Well, no, I mean, all hell breaks loose, and multiple things can happen. But if you're lucky enough to have the 6 months or longer, that's why these relationships develop. And I know some patients in the hospital feel that the staff is dismissive of them, and I think it's really because of all that they have to do in the hospital for documentation. When hospital rounds are held, The doctor comes in and, quite frankly, pontificates and makes statements and give orders and walks out, and he's gone. He's gone for at least 24 hours. And the head nurse is so busy with her iPad documenting everything that happened and what was said that the patient, when this team leaves, turns to the nurse assistant and to the person cleaning the room. What did they say?
Right.
And socioeconomically, some patients are on the same level as the housekeeping and the nurse assistants, which is too bad regarding patient communication. In fact, I think probably the most, I guess they're overlooked, I would say, is the certified nurse assistant. The person that comes in and talks to the patient, touches the patient, gives the bath, gets them out of bed, and the power of touch. Well, you go to a barber and he touches you and you just want to tell everything you know. Same with women and hairdressers, okay? But the power of touch, and they are usually dismissed by the staff as unimportant people hanging around. So I just want to put in a plug for them because they have conferences on these patients and everyone is there, and the nurse assistant is expected to contribute what she can in this story and what needs to be done.
So what are the common regrets that you hear people talk about at the end of their lives?
Well, let me give you an anecdote here. I had a professor from MSU, a brilliant man. We developed a very close relationship. And he had a wife, a second wife, who was very devoted to him. And when he died, his mother blamed the wife because she didn't take as good a care of the patient as she would have.
That's quite a guilt trip to lay on somebody, isn't it?
But she called me in tears because she had just gotten the letter that I had written that absolved her of guilt. And she says, now I can show her something now. And I thought, wow, family dynamics.
Yeah.
Family dynamics.
It seemed to make a lot of sense to me in preparing for this interview today. I read about this hospice life review.
Yes.
And just sitting down with a patient and asking them about their early life when they were children and the things they remember, and then progressing on to their adolescence and their work career and then their later life, and lots of spending time talking about it. I would think that maybe that would get you out of the immediate issue of the fact that you don't have long to live, and create perspective about your life, and maybe help you put things in the proper context.
I think that's a wonderful tool. And one of the requirements that hospice has, Medicare hospice has, is that there must be volunteers. And that is an excellent role for a volunteer that's willing to take it on and sit with the patient, write down the answers. Some volunteers come in and write letters for the patient, who dictates them for people. So everyone at every level of care can offer something for the patient.
I was reading something the other day, and as we get older, a lot of us tend to think in terms of what is our legacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
This one columnist was saying we shouldn't talk and think in those terms. Instead, we should reframe it in terms of what is our life's purpose, and what are we going to do while we're still around. Care to respond to that?
I think it's a great idea. I think it's a motivator, and I think no matter what stage you're in life, it always is good to ask yourself these questions. And one question that I think that families should ask each other every day at the dinner table with the kids there and everyone. So what would you do different today if you had a chance to live it over? Yeah. And I think that's especially good for kids, and it's amazing what they'll say and what they'll confess.
That reminds me, there was an ancient Stoic philosopher called Epictetus, and he was a slave, actually, a Roman slave, and then he was freed and wrote a lot of Stoic philosophy. But what he reframed the events in his life. So let's just say, for example, some bad thing happened to him today. Your wife's fixing a fabulous dinner and burns up the pot roast right before everybody gets there. And rather than being frustrated and unhappy, looking at that as, quote, Epictetus would have said this is a gift from the gods. Because this gives you a teaching moment, an opportunity to learn from this experience so that you can grow in the future. And so you would deal with it and then do after-the-fact examination. How did I handle that issue?
Yeah.
And how can I handle it better in the future? And so rather than saying, woe is me, he suggested, think of this as an opportunity.
Yeah.
And that's what, when you were talking about talking with kids around the dinner table, it reminded me of that.
Yeah.
It seems to me the things that you want to do toward the end of your life is be an exemplar for the rest of your family.
Right, absolutely. I think someone on hospice should consider the mission that they're on now is to show their family how to die with grace and peace. I think that's something that we need to be teaching our kids.
I owned an old house, 100 years old, 2-story house, North Springfield. We lived there for a long time. And in the front, the room was called the parlor.
Mm-hmm.
And there were stories the people who had lived there before had written about various things that happened. They would talk about when somebody died. They put them out there on a table for people to come say goodbye to them. You know, I guess you would get them buried rather quickly, but nevertheless, children were used to the idea of death.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do that anymore.
Right.
Why is that?
We're too busy. We shield children from unpleasant things. I don't know.
Do you think we should?
Well, I think that children should be told everything that's going on because I think they're more perceptive than you can imagine. They pick up on things. And, you know, I wasn't smart enough to learn about my brother's diagnosis, but once I heard those words of cancer of the blood, it all fell into place. Click.
Yeah.
I knew why Mother wasn't there. I knew why they had to make these weekly trips. It all fell into place.
What should you tell a 6-year-old that's got a terminal diagnosis?
Well, I think you have to be honest with them. They know about death, and I think you have to gently let them know what's happening, because if you don't, they will know that something is wrong and you're not being truthful to them.
Have you ever heard anybody say, I wish I'd spent more time in the office?
Never. Yep.
When they talk about the events in their life, do people talk about how much money they amassed, or they tend to talk more about their experiences and relationships?
I think they talk about family.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about family. But now that you've brought that up,
okay,
I want to tell you about a program that Hospice Foundation of the Ozarks has.
Great, okay.
Which is called Bucket List Plus One.
Bucket List Plus One.
Everyone has a bucket list upon retirement. Trips they want to take, people they want to see, things they want to do. But the plus one is taking care of your advance directives. And this little packet allows you to do everything that is legal to make your final wishes known regarding whether or not you want to be on life support, whether or not you want to undergo cardiac resuscitation, do you want to be on a feeding tube in a vegetative state? All these questions are here for you to answer. And it is a legal document that is notarized. And this is so helpful, I think, to the family to know what the patient wants ahead of time. So, well, I don't know. What do you think we should do? You know, that type of thing. It's here in a document. And this document should then be taken to the patient's physician and put in the medical record. But the document should also be in plastic and taped to the refrigerator.
Okay.
So that when someone panics in the middle of the night, say a relative from out of town happens to be patient sitting, shall I say, and a catastrophe occurs and they call an ambulance and the patient is rushed to the hospital and the wishes are not known, and here they are, intubated and in the ICU, and what do you want to do now? You've missed an opportunity of doing what the patient wanted, and you've really caused a disaster. That's why even when they go to the hospital, they've got to go to a certain place in the electronic medical record to find it, and that may get overlooked. That's why I say you need to have this in written form to go with the patient whenever they leave. So this is some of the things that Hospice Foundation of the Ozarks is doing. This is an organization that was funded by the sale of the first hospice in Springfield. Hospice of Southwest Missouri was a volunteer hospice, no charge for the services. And it was the first one in the area, and developed by the main person that did this was Pat Walker.
Oh, I remember Pat.
She was a community activist.
Oh, she sure
was.
Great Springfield and historian.
Yes, the downtown work she did. She was instrumental in the first VNA, Visiting Nurse Association, and she got the ball rolling with hospice. She got Bill Cheek, a cardiologist here, who was dying. And she went to him and she asked him to write a letter to all the physicians of Greene County about the importance of hospice. And he did. And that really got the medical team on board. It has been sort of waylaid a little bit with all the new developments in medicine, but the physicians were behind it 100% when we started the first hospice. Well, it didn't take Medicare long to realize this was a good benefit, and it didn't take entrepreneurs long to find out that they could make money from hospice. Right. So they bought Hospice of Southwest Missouri and turned it private. And then the money that they put forth to buy it was created the Hospice Foundation of the Ozarks. So that's our money base.
Okay.
Initially, they didn't know what to do with it. So they accepted applications from patients in dire straits. And so they would get these poor, pathetic letters of patients who were dying and had no money, and there was no... It was so sad, but they decided that doling out money to individuals was not going to be a long-lasting way to handle it, that they needed to reorganize and develop an educational program. Then there was the movement to create a hospice house here, which means a freestanding facility that the hospice people would all service. But it had to be supported by the two major medical centers here, and medical politics reared its head, and it was not possible to get together to do that joint venture. And they hired a consultant to come to try to organize this, but it just didn't work. So then the organization became a granting organization to other organizations to do the work that needs to be done. And most recently, we have decided that this work is so important. This Bucket List Plus One was actually developed by a Drury student, and it's
is that right?
copyrighted now. So
how do people access this?
You call the Office of Hospice Foundation of the Ozarks. Their office is on South Fremont. Just Google them. You can get their address and their phone number. They will answer any question. They are knowledgeable about hospice and can form a screening and suggest that they call a hospice of their choice. They serve all hospices, so they don't direct to one or two particular hospices.
Okay.
And that's what people should do if they have questions. It costs nothing to ask questions and get information. And they have lots of literature and lots of experience in this area to serve as a community resource.
Bob, this has been a really informative interview. Before we end it, is there anything else that I haven't asked you about?
One important misconception, right up there with hospice means you're giving up. Some people have been spreading the story that hospice is euthanasia. It is not, and I want to clarify that. Hospice preserves life, and we are just switching our care to a treatment plan, a care plan that is appropriate for the patient status, meaning no aggressive toxic treatment.
Well, it's good to destroy that illusion.
Yes, it's got to go.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for being my guest today on In Our Town.
It's been my pleasure.
That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/In Our Town, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.